Hello, everybody. CUDAN Open Lab Seminar, fall 2022. This is the first iteration. It's also the first one this semester that we do in person. Jer Thorp is here from New York. He will speak about time, space, and place, how to break all of Plato's rules. So, particularly about the rules of Edward Tuftian, which I couldn't be more happy about this. So the key thing is that what we do here is slightly awkward for the people in the room. The speaker is facing away from you, but we all face a large Zoom screen. So we see ourselves and look at the slides. We also look at the people that are off-site. And we have set it up that way that sort of all sound will come into here and out of here. So questions and answers can be done as usual. If you have questions, put them in the chat. Or lift your hand in the room, or lift your hand on Zoom. We will get to that. The standard format of this whole event series is 2-hour time slot, and the speaker can do whatever they want in the 2 hours. If you speak for 10 minutes,
you can have I'll have a nap for part of it. Yeah,
we will talk to you anyway. So the idea is like sort of you can use whatever. If you talk for 2 hours, there's no discussion, and if you talk for 40 minutes, you talk for we have a discussion for 80 minutes. As this is the first one in the series, at cudan.clu.de/events/ there's all the events of the semester. And I've sent out invitation email to all the people already on the list. There's a way to get on the list. And two other things that I would like to have everybody in mind is there will be a CUDAN conference, a cultural data analytics conference, like not specifically our project, but in general, and so we like you to have your calendars marked. This will happen in fall 2023, but obviously there will be a call for papers, and we have to build a program committee and so on. And then the other thing that we have going right now is there is a thing called the Cultural Science Journal, which is still obscure and driven by one group, where we are asking for commentary till December, which is also then. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for being here, and with the greatest pleasure, let's give the word to Jer Thorp.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's really great to be here. It's a part of the world that I've always wanted to visit, and it's nice to, after a few years of doing these types of things from my living room, to be in a room with people. I also love it. It's maybe a little hard to see on Zoom, but like all the blackboards are filled with like the most legitimately realistic looking formulas and diagrams. Like if you were gonna film a movie and you wanted to make it seem like people were doing really like tricky type of science work, you would do it in this room. It's really nice. I think I'm assuming this is real and not decorative. Like you didn't hire a set designer to come in and make this look really sciencey. But it's really nice. It's really nice to be here. I will put a caveat on this talk, and that is that I am very jet lagged. I think that's another result of not traveling for a long time, is that my body isn't used to this idea of moving from time zone to time zone. So I have no idea what's going on. And then I have a really strict rule in my life where I never have more than one caffeinated beverage during a day, and I've had 3. And so I feel a little bit like a hummingbird right now. And so if I'm talking very quickly or nothing makes any sense at all, it's because I've had far too much caffeine. And then the sort of other preface to the talk is a little bit longer. So I met Max in 2010, which was right at the kind of beginning of my adventures with data, if you will. So I'd spent the 10 years beforehand as an artist who was using software. So I was a generative artist, and I would write programs that would create visual systems using algorithms and number generators, and I was really interested in recreating natural systems. But I sort of found a point where I became frustrated with the types of things that could come out of my laptop. And so I kind of on a whim tried to think about ways I could like get numbers in from the rest of the world. And that is how I got into data visualization. And actually the very first data source that I used was the New York Times API. And it was totally coincidental. It just happened to be that they released the API on the weekend where I was like, I need some data. And so I started exploring the API. And what I learned quite quickly is that my 10 years of being a generative artist was basically training to be a data visualizer, because I knew how to take numbers and make them individual things. And I think what was also interesting about that is that I had no training in data visualization at all. So I came to it with this total other training about how to take numbers and make them individual things. And right away, actually, looking back at it now and maybe in this context, it became clear to me that I was really interested in ways to not make things simpler, but instead to show their kind of full complexity. So this is one of the very early graphics that I made as part of a series that's called 365-360, and this is an entire year of news from the New York Times and the entities in the stories, and it's a network diagram. So when they're connected to each other, the lines connect. And this is a series. There's 30 years of them, and at a glance, you can see kind of what happens in the news in a particular year, but also, right away, again, I was interested in resisting simplification. I wanted to show that this stuff was actually really complicated, and there were a lot of things going on. And you can probably gather from this that my career as an artist and somebody who was interested in aesthetic really came into it. So I was not only interested in what the data could show, but also how the data visualization could work as an aesthetic object. And so you'll sort of see that continue. So I then kind of went from static things to moving things and interaction. So this is an early project from 2009 called Just Landed, where I scraped Twitter looking for people saying, I just landed in, or I just arrived in, and then taking a guess at where they were traveling from because of their profile. I plotted these long periods of time of people traveling across the world, and kind of experimented with these ways to show this data in different ways. And again, the idea here wasn't really to take the system and make it simpler. It was to show everything that was happening all at the same time. This is a sister project to that one called Good Morning. This is everybody on one day in 2009 saying good morning on Twitter. Twitter was a friendlier place in 2009. People would wake up and be like, good morning, everybody. And you're like, oh, hi, everybody. Like it was kind of an innocent place. So the green dots are people here who are saying good morning early, and the red ones are people who are saying good morning really late. There's some weird geocoding. There isn't actually a whole bunch of people in the middle of Brazil saying good morning. It's just the centroid to people who are in the country of Brazil. So there's a lot of stuff that I would do differently if I did it again. But these things are really rewarding to me in a way that we really got to see things that you hadn't been able to see before. I mean, there's no prizes to be won by the fact that everybody wakes up in the morning, but there was something nice to see this. Twitter facilitated the collection of the data set like this in kind of the first possible time of everybody engaging with each other over time. And so I spent maybe the next 6 or 7 years really engaged in these exact sort of ideas. How can we take large data sets, time-based data sets, network data sets, and how can we visualize them in ways that were unconventional and most often interactive. So these last two things I showed you are videos of an interactive tool. So you can actually zoom in and kind of see what's going on. You could actually read the tweets and so on and so on. And so there's like all this really relevant work, I think, to what happens in this lab. And I'm not going to talk about any of it for the next however long we have. I thought it would be more interesting to bring things that maybe feel a little outside of what is happening in this group, and kind of talk specifically when I propose this idea of talking about breaking data rules, it might be easy to accept that, or to understand it as like things like, oh, don't use a pie chart, or represent area with a square with a square root. Like those types of rules, those are not the rules I'm talking about. I'm talking about these sort of deeply rooted societal rules about what data is, who gets to speak its language, and the ways in which we tell it to each other. So I want to talk about really kind of breaking our understanding of the way that data sort of functions. And so this guy is, some of you may be familiar with the name. This is Harold Fisk. He was a Army Corps engineer, a geologist. And in the early 1930s, he was commissioned to make this report about the history of the Mississippi Valley and the sort of alluvial valley of the Mississippi. And he wrote this really incredible paper, which you probably haven't read. You should. It's really amazing. This is really incredible achievement, actually. It was done extraordinarily quickly, and it's this really fascinating synthesis of tons and tons of data. They went out and did thousands of core drillings into the riverbed, and then they also did analysis of aerial photographs, which were a pretty new technology at the time, to understand the history, the sort of multi-million-year history of the Mississippi Valley. So while you haven't probably read the paper, you probably have at one point seen the maps that came out of it. And these maps, I don't remember when the first time I saw them, that they're these just ridiculously beautiful. I don't know why it's not showing on screen. We're one slide behind, but that's okay. So there are these really ridiculously beautiful, multi-layered things that sort of tell the story of the geology of the river over time. And so the white graphic that you see there is the current state of the river at the time, and then all the other ones are sort of these ghosts of where the river used to be, that they found from these explorations of data. And it's really worth saying, I wrote about these maps in my book, and one of the things that I figured out is that we call these maps the Fisk maps because Fisk was the PI, but they were almost certainly drawn by this guy. His name is R.H. Smith. And so I'm trying to encourage everybody to refer to them as the Fisk-Smith maps, or the Smith-Fisk maps. And his signature is on, well, he's included in the list of the people who made the maps. And also, if you go through a lot of the other graphics that were produced by this group, it's really clear that the ones that he was involved with had that kind of really beautiful use of color. And it seems almost 100% that he was the one that was involved in this. And so anyways, I've been thinking about these maps for a really long time. And when I started to sit down to write about them in the book, I realized that one of the things that was really clear, first of all, let me just take 1 second to explain these maps. So they were printed as a supplement to the paper. And for $1.25, including postage, you could get the paper mailed to you with these plates. And there were 29 of them, I believe. My number might be wrong, and they're huge. They're each about 3 feet tall, and if you were to lay them out end to end, they're about 200 feet. 60 something meters of map. There's really amazing things, and I went to the New York Public Library's map room when I was starting to write, because I wanted to see these maps in person. I'd seen lots of images of them, but I'd never seen the maps. And I put them out. I put a couple of them out on this table, and I climbed up this rickety ladder, and they brought out to me so I could photograph them. And I'm not really good with heights, and I was kind of like starting to feel a little dizzy. But I sort of came to this realization that the reason why these maps are so amazing is that Fisk and his colleagues kind of understood that the river was not this kind of static thing, but rather the river was this ongoing conversation between water and earth and time, and that changed my mind about the way that I was going to write the book, and also changed my mind about the framing of the work that I've done since the stuff that I started showing you. And for me, the change has been to understand data not as a thing, but as this system of relationships between humans and information and time. There's something going on with this where it's like a minute behind my own slides.
Oh, really?
And it seems to be getting longer. So yeah, like this was about a minute ago, or like 45 seconds ago.
What are we gonna do? Reshare? Yeah. Reshare. Yes.
Yeah, I'll try that. Good idea. Thank you. That's why I have all you back here.
Good time to reshare, water, earth, and time.
Sorry. All right. Right, so this sort of recasting of the idea of data as this network, this system of interactions between these three things really helped me understand not only the work that I was doing, but some things that I was kind of for a long time fascinated with. Just as a little bit of a framing, and this is probably things that everybody here kind of knows about. But the word data is something that all of us in this room probably have an understanding of what I'm talking about when I speak about the word data. But if you were just to like go on a bus and talk to somebody about what data is, they probably have a different understanding of what that thing is. I've sort of done this over the last decade, like kind of asked people, hey, what do you think I'm talking about when I'm talking about data? And it's really clear to me that actually, even within small groups like this, if I were to ask everybody, we probably would have slightly different ideas of exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about data. And so I wanted to kind of trace that back, and so I did a little bit of research about the word itself. So data is a loan word from Latin, and it came into the English language in the context of theology. And it was literally something that was given to us from God. And so that's where the word first appears. It's this thing that comes from the heavens, right? It's inhuman, it's holy, it's pure. It's like it's a thing that's divine. And then from there, it moved into the realm of mathematics, where it was something, again, that was given. So the word given persists. So when we're learning math in high school, you're trying to work out an equation. You have things that are unknown, and then you have things that are given. So again, we have this kind of binding of the word data to truth, and to this thing that is kind of untouchable in a way. We're still, it's doing the same delay thing again. Well, I'll just try to remember what's coming next. And so it sort of rests here for a while as in mathematics as these things that are like inarguable. They're just sort of things that are that sort of have to be accepted. And then it sits there for quite a long time. And then in the 1970s, well, actually before that with the birth of modern statistics, but certainly in the 1970s with the sort of development and advancement of computation, data becomes bound with the computer. So if I ask most people, define data, they're probably going to like use some computational terms because we accept it as a thing now that lives alongside a computer, even though it, for most of its life, hasn't lived alongside a computer. And so, so sort of that sort of brings us to where we are right now. But so this word has changed over the course of 400 years. But one thing that became clear to me was that it's changing now again, and it's changing probably faster than it ever has before, how we understand the word data. And so I wanted to understand how this works. And I want to like kind of apologize for showing my like half-assed network work in this group because you guys are all so sophisticated at this. But so I wanted to understand kind of how this word was changing. So I used word Quebec and I scraped the entire New York Times corpus and I used word Quebec to create these maps of sort of all the common words, and then sort of move them over time. And so I could see how certain words were becoming closer or further apart from one another. And specifically by using data as a centroid there, the red dot in the middle, I was able to see what words were moving further from data and which ones were coming closer to data. And the words that were moving farther away from data are actually ones that certainly in my, like, born in the 1970s, like these are the words that I most closely associate with data, but these are the ones that are drifting away from the societal understanding of what data is. And then the ones that are getting closer, this shouldn't surprise you. Yeah, this is like you could string these words in any order and come up with a headline in any sort of given newspaper day. So this is one set of them, which are the kind of dystopian ones, but then there's another set of words that are coming closer to data, which I think are really fascinating. So this sort of like gives me a lot of hope and centers the thinking of the work that I want to show you. So, how can we take data and bring it closer to words like this? The ones on the top, which are the ones that are already moving closer to it, but then some of these other ones that we might imagine about how we can really push to bring these things more closely together. So when I was sitting down to write the book, I realized that I had this sort of series of projects that these are called hitchhiker seeds. Anybody that's ever been hiking knows what they are. They get stuck to your socks, and then you find them 3 years later stuck to your sock. So I had these projects that had stuck in my mind, and this kind of new recasting of how I was thinking about data really helped me understand why they had stuck in my mind. And I want to show you a couple of them, and then some projects that I've been working on, and then we'll have a kind of conversation. So this guy is his name is James Yarker. He runs a theater group in England called Stan's Caf. It's spelled the way that you would say cafe, but in England you call it a calf. And so Stan's Caf is this really interesting experimental theater group that has been running for a couple of decades. And James grew up in this really small town on the coast of England and didn't really do any traveling whatsoever until he was an adult, and one of their first pieces became quite successful, and they toured it all around the world. And kind of in like that naive young way, you might have had this experience when you start to travel, you're like, holy shit, the world's big, right? Like he was like, the world is so much bigger than I imagined. And he started to become obsessed with this world population number, which at the time was around 6.5 billion. And he was trying to conceive of ways that you might tell numbers like that. And so he gave this assignment to his students at the time about like trying to build a representation of those numbers, and they all kind of came back to him and said it was kind of impossible because anything that was discrete enough would like there's too much of it, and anything that's small enough to show it you couldn't really see. And he didn't want to give up on the idea, a few months later, he was at a grocery store and was like buying a bag of rice, and he thought, this is it. I'm going to represent the world's population as a pile of rice. And he sat down and he went home and he started doing the calculations and realized that it would, I can't remember the actual number, but it would cost him something like 40,000 pounds to like buy enough rice to show the world. And so he was like, okay, we won't do that, but we'll do the population of Britain. So the first performance, this is a performance of this project called, the piece is called Of All the People in All the World, happened in a warehouse in Birmingham. And the way the piece works is that they take over a public space, and this group of people who are dressed as kind of bureaucrats. So the idea is that you've stumbled on like a public office that you didn't know existed. It's like the Bureau of Counting. And when you go in there, they're all actively counting rice, and they're arranging it into these piles that represent different things. And so every time they do the project, it's different. And so it depends on kind of what the thing is, but you know, they'll do these countings and comparisons of numbers. And you know, I became even more obsessed with this project after I wrote the book, actually. And as we kind of went into COVID, where every day we were exposed to all these numbers, and I realized sort of how intractable these numbers are to most people. Like when I say a number like, you know, 251,000, nobody knows what that number is. It's like, we don't have a good ability to conceive this. And so this is like at the root of this project was James's understanding that we have these numbers that are so critical to us that we don't have a good way of like grappling with. And not only that, you know, this piece does something which I think is really amazing, which and that is that it occupies a real public space. So when most of us encounter data, we encounter it maybe on a website or in a textbook or in a paper. There are these really rarefied spaces where data is meant to serve a certain purpose. But when you take it out of those spaces and put it somewhere different, you allow people to engage with it in a way that is like less clinical and less analytic and more kind of visceral. And interestingly, I think social. Like this is a piece that you probably wouldn't go alone to go. You would go with your family, your friends, and so you have this opportunity to kind of talk around things. And the scale of this piece really allows for that, right? So this pile in the back is that Great Britain pile, and when you go into the piece, they give you one little grain of rice so you can understand like how you exist in the context of these other things. So it's really wonderful for all kinds of reasons. I love the low techness of it. You know, it's just like printed paper and rice. I love the fact that it unfolds over time, that it involves performance. It's like, it really is a data visualization, but it's done in a way that is so different from the way that we understand data visualizations work. So they did get a chance eventually in Stuttgart, actually, to do the entire world's population. It took 4 big trucks full of rice, and this is the pile. So that's, I think at the time it was 8 billion grains of rice. Which I I love this idea that kind of decades later, James kind of realized this challenge that he was focused on. And I asked him, I went to his studio in Birmingham, and it was a really funny place because it's like everywhere there's like all these little bags of rice and measuring equipment and stuff like that. But I asked him like, why does this work? And he had this really nice thing to say, which is that like these rice, they kind of they're shaped a little bit like humans, and so we can understand them as actual people. So a different project, but a very different project. But I hope you'll understand sort of how these things align. So in 1999, the artist / scientist / designer / provocateur Natalie Jeremijenko did this project in San Francisco in the Bay Area, where she raised these clones of a specific type of chestnut tree. They're called, or walnut tree rather, they're called paradox walnuts. They're a special hybrid that's kind of designed not to fruit too much, so you don't kind of get a mess. And they're vigorous, and they're kind of good to plant in cities. But so these are clones. They're genetically identical saplings, and they were all planted in pairs around the Bay Area. And they were planted by parks workers, but also by scientists, by school groups. This is what a paradox walnut looks like at full size. They live about 350 years. And so the idea of this project, I think, is really elegant, and that is that because these trees are genetically identical, the way that they will thrive or not thrive is dependent on the place and the sort of social context in which they exist. And so they become, she calls them social registers. They're like these ways to show like their visualizations of the health of a specific neighborhood. These trees over time will become these representations of the city's history. And so I was really fascinated with this project. This is a couple of the trees, I think about 5 years after they were planted. And so I went to San Francisco, and I spent a day walking around the city, and I realized a couple of things. The first is that media art projects that were made in 1999 were like really, really badly documented, and the website was broken and nothing was available, and there was no map of where these trees were. And so it was this really weird sort of excavation of a project. And so I ended up finding about 5 or 6 different pairs of these trees all over the city. And it was really fascinating because they actually sort of did serve the purpose that she was describing. There was these pairs of trees that were thriving. There was these ones that this is some that I took a picture of that were on an art school campus, and they'd obviously like been well tended to, and they were they were these big, beautiful trees. And then there were others that were kind of stunted. And then there was lots that were gone. There had been a development that had come in, or maybe the trees had died. What I realized that I hadn't understood about this project, I had always been kind of fascinated by the elegance of it. Like, oh, we're using these trees as these kind of ways to represent data over time. But what I didn't realize is that the only way to sort of understand this project and to really see it is to use your body, like you're walking. And if it was the first time that I'd ever been exhausted by data, well, that's not true. I've been mentally exhausted by data many times, but it was like the first time that I got back to the hotel, and I was like, my legs were like really tired, and I was like, oh my God, my legs are tired because I've been experiencing data. Like, what a weird kind of way to see things. And so, this project involves the same type of idea as the last one about bringing data into public space, but it also really breaks our ideas of how long a story that is told by data can last for, right? This is a project that will last for centuries. And it's also a thing that, is not neatly understood in a single place. In 1999, I think this is really prescient idea from Natalie, and she talks about this idea of, one of the challenges we're facing as we're looking at climate change, and these increasing sort of crises and so on is our like inability to understand these systems that occur over time that is so different than our sort of understanding of time. We build data visualizations largely to be consumed in periods of minutes, and if not minutes, seconds. We assume people, or we require ourselves to kind of bond with people over a very, very, very brief amount of time. And I become sort of obsessed with this, that one of the underlying myths that we tell ourselves about data visualization is that it's a way to change people's minds. But if you look at your life, how many times has your mind ever been changed in the scale of seconds and minutes? Like, never. These things take time. If we talk about the ability to build trust, for example, like trust is not something that happens quickly. And so I've been really interested in the idea of how do we build visualizations and how do we build data into people's lives in a way that's more persistent, so that we're not accepting them to sort of make some major change to the way that they think in seconds or minutes, but we're kind of breaking that down into more kind of elapsed my jet lag is, I can't even think of words right now. So anyway, so this is, to change that into a different statement, one of the ways that I've been really critical about my own work and the own way that I think is like, how are the ways that I've learned to tell data, how do they restrict the ways we can tell them and who we tell it to? Well, one of the things that I think I became really disillusioned with was the idea that, and this comes back to my mention of Tufti, is that like, I think a lot of the rules we give ourselves about how we tell data assume that we're talking to people who are just like us. Like we're assuming we're talking to people who have the same types of training, the same types of background, the same type of literacies, the same types of the privilege that we have. And if you go and look at these kind of canonical rules that we explain to ourselves about the way we should talk about data, you look at them in that lens, to me anyways, it really exposes this fact that we talk to ourselves. And when we talk about these kind of giant problems that we do need to get better at talking to the general public about, I think we need to question how many of these rules that we've convinced ourselves of are actually a burden to our ability to speak to them in a broader level. So I'm going to show you some work that I did as part of a studio that I ran for 8 years called the Office for Creative Research. They're a super amazing group of people, except for that guy. He works for Palantir now, so he's dead to me. So this is a project that was designed by two colleagues of mine, Noah Younts and Genevieve Hoffman. We were asked in the end of 2016 to propose a piece for Times Square. They've traditionally put a sculpture in Times Square to celebrate Valentine's Day. And we had all these kind of ideas, and then we realized that with the Trump administration about to pass these really sweeping Muslim bans in the country, that we wanted to make a statement rather than just do something aesthetic. And so this project is called We Were Strangers Once Too. And so the front, it looks like a heart. It's kind of designed so that at a place it all comes together perfectly into a heart. But actually what it is this kind of stacked bar charts, and it's the foreign-born population in New York City. So New York City has got the highest number of foreign-born people of any city in the world, both by number and percentage. So it's like this really incredibly rich place as far as people who are born elsewhere. And we wanted to bring this right into the middle of the square. And so it's quite a big sculpture, and people walk in it, which is, again, we talk about breaking data's rules. It's like, that's not something you expect to do with data, right? Like, I'm going to go like walk through this data. But this person here is doing the thing that people did most often. And that is they found a place that they were connected to and kind of took a picture in front of it. And so this, I don't know what she's doing. Maybe she's sending it to a friend or her grandmother or somebody. And so there was this way that, again, this is something that I'd never really seen through any of my work, where people were making this really personal connection to the data. And I want to go back to something I said before, which is the way that we're expected to, or the way that we've come to kind of experience data in our lives is really voluntary. Like I click on a link, or I subscribe to a journal, or whatever it is. This is the opposite of that. Like, we're kind of surprising you with data, and so you're not coming into this space having gone to NewYorkTimes.com with some understanding of what the kind of political biases around it. We're putting it into your life in a way that is sort of different and unexpected. So we had just like millions of people see this piece. When I talk about data sculpture, sometimes people are like, oh, it's like this weird little niche thing. But by far and away, this project was seen by more people than anything I've ever done. This is the busiest public square in the world, and we have more than 1 million people come through every single day. And then it got picked up by news media all over the world. And so they do this, they have this agency that tracks impressions, and this piece had over 1 billion impressions, over 1 billion media impressions. So it was like, oh my God, this did something that we had never sort of been able to do. And we had a bunch of people get married in front of it, which is, I think, sort of something you don't expect, again, for data visualization. So this, I'm going to go backwards in time a little bit. You know, I'm getting a little, the step here is to sort of get weirder, right? Like get kind of less conventional as we go along. So this is a piece that we did. Oh, I can't even remember when. 2013, I think 2014. So we were approached by the Museum of Modern Art to do a residency there with their education program, but as part of it, we would produce some type of artwork. And we had done this work with another experimental theater company called the Elevator Repair Service before. They're this really wonderful, like really experimental theater group who's really famous for performing unconventional texts. So by doing like performing things that you wouldn't usually consider performable. And so we thought, okay, well, we're going to perform the database. And so we staged a series of performances. We did 8 performances. They were 40-minute performances in which every word that came out of the actors' mouths was verbatim from the database. And we used the system, a combination of, we sort of use theater language. So we have these scenes that we produced that some were algorithmic and they would change every time. And some were sort of a combination of computational approaches and manual approaches. And so, you know, we did the same thing that we would normally do when we're facing a data set like this. And that is that we started to, this is an image of one of the performers, is that we just started to sort of ask the data questions. And so we were interested in, you know, what type of pattern we could find from this. And when I was listening to some of your research, it was like these types of approaches you were talking about like how do we find pattern within artworks? There's something that I think is interesting when you start to ask yourself, how do these systems that you're creating, how could they be performed? How could they be performed in a way that you sort of are sharing the results of that in a way that engages directly again with the kind of place and the artwork itself. And so, you know, we did some really simple things. So this is a pretty clear database text search. You know, this is which is part of the video that you're going to see in a second. And then you know, we were sitting in the room, and one of my colleagues, Mark Hansen, who's a statistician as well as a really amazing artist, and he said, hey, listen to this. And he just started reading this really simple script that he'd written, which was to look at the first names of every artist in the database and sort of rank them. So there are 200 artists who have work in the museum's permanent collection who have the first name of John. So these are the top 4. These are the top 40. I'll give you a minute to find the one female name in there. And so there was something actually really interesting about this, because we knew right away this is something we wanted to talk about, but we also actually were given the way we wanted to talk about it, and that was that Mark reading the names. Like, names are something that are actually sort of meant to be spoken out loud, and by speaking them, you get something different than you do when you just read it. So we worked together with the choreographer and the director of the theater group, and we ended up doing this scene, which I'm going to show you here. I'll just let you watch it.
No title, fuck the world. The sequel, shut the fuck up.
Oops. Sorry, go back. All right, preview of the weird change we're gonna make.
No title, fuck the world. The sequel, shut the fuck up. I shit crystals for you, David. Not
John
fuck off.
John Woo.
John William Carter.
The bad
John
habit.
Wendy Senior.
Ass kicking,
John Waters.
food eating,
John
head
Waters.
shrinking,
John Walker.
social
John
climbing,
John
motherfucker.
Bouchard.
John Sutter.
John Thompson.
John
Shut the
Taylor.
fuck up.
John Skarkowski.
John Swan.
John
The
Sturgeon.
sequel,
John Sorensen.
John
shut the fuck
John
up.
John Sloan. John
John
Stenhauser.
Stenhauser.
John Sales. John
John
Falk. John R.
Morgan.
Morgan. John Riley.
John
John
Carroll.
Piper. John Pilson. John Pemberton. John Paul Jones.
John
John
Hudson.
Opp. John Newman. John Newsom. John Mills. John McVicker. John Levy.
Untitled,
Robert,
people squeezed between fucked up. Nazi punk fuck off.
David,
I shit crystals for you, David.
Paul, Richard, William, Peter, Charles, Michael, James, George, Jean, Hans, Thomas, Walter, Edward, Jan, Joseph, Martin, Mark, Jose, Louis, Frank, Otto, Max, Stephen, Jack, Henry, Henri, Alfred, Alexander, Carl, Andre, Harry, Roger, Pierre,
Mary.
Daniel, Carl, Philip, Juan, Bob, Arthur, Albert, Christian, Bruce, Jim, Bill, Tom, Fritz, Victor, Bernard, Antonio, Alex, Roberto, Mario,
Joan. Barbara.
Werner, Tony,
Maria.
Marcel, Jonathan, Boris, Alan.
I won't show the whole thing. The idea here was to take this relatively simple data set that had come out of our analysis and try to put it in a context, not only actually in the museum, so that you're in that institutional context where the data have come from, but then also to think about how performance itself lets us tell a story that is pretty challenging in the ways that we normally talk about data. Like the thing I like the most about this is that there's kind of this drawn out tension as you wait for the first female name to be spoken. And that medium of performance allows you to tell that story and to sort of associate a resonance with it that I don't think would be possible in really any other way. And the thing that I love about working with performers is that you have this other layer of representation, right? You have the way that you turn data into the script, but then you have the way that the actor interprets that thing, and then you have the way the audience understands it. So you have this new layer that usually doesn't exist in the way that we tell data. Usually we have a data set, I create a visualization, and then the reader looks at it, and there's that kind of layer of possible kind of interpretation in the middle. And this adds another one, which again, is another thing that we tend to not think we want when we're talking about data. It's oh, I don't want to muddy things up. But when we're talking about topics that maybe have nuance or that carry, political and emotional resonance, I think there's a lot to be given by allowing people to find different ways to attach themselves to it than these really prescribed ways that we offer them usually. So actually, a couple of years after that, we were commissioned by this real estate developer in Calgary. They were building a brand new office building, and they were commissioning public art. And we kind of on a lark proposed this idea. So Calgary, if you're probably not familiar with Calgary, Alberta in Canada, it's the Houston of Canada. It's the center of the oil and gas market. It's a very right-wing place. It's sort of the whole place is built on fossil fuels, and so we came up with this idea that we would put the voice of a glacier into front of this building, such that people who are coming to commute to work in the fossil fuel industries would be confronted with this glacier in its kind of last days. And so this is us right at the top of this gigantic ice field called the Wapta ice field, and just sort of to the right is the glacier. It's called the Bow Glacier. So the Bow Glacier feeds into the Bow Lake, which feeds into the Bow River, and the Bow River goes right through Calgary. Half of Calgary's drinking water comes from the Bow. And so if you live in Calgary, you like very like literally have this mountain in your bones with all the minerals that you've kind of drunk from that water. But most people haven't seen the glacier, and you know, this is the reality of our relationship with nature and these kind of places, is that most of us do not see them. We don't have a connection to them, even though they influence our lives in so many ways. So this is hard to see on purpose. We tried to make it like relatively hard to see, but this is, we call it our seismic observatory. So it's a solar powered sensor station that we designed and built that lives permanently up on the glacier. And inside of it are these seismic instruments and a whole lot of car batteries to keep it alive when there's no sun or everything gets snowed over in the wintertime. And what it's doing is it's listening to the movement of the glacier. You know, before I worked on this project, I kind of thought about glaciers as quiet things, but they're absolutely not. They're like very active. They're moving all the time. If you put your ear down to a glacier, well, you'll get cold, but you hear it kind of crack and pop and shift, and there's always things happening. And it changes through the year as the melt happens and as all these different things happen. And so the way that this works is there's a radio bridge between the glacier and a lodge about 10 kilometers away. And then we send that data up as close to real time as we can into this plaza in front of the oil and gas headquarters, this building called Brookfield Place. And we work with these stonemasons to take the topology of the glacier and build it into the plaza. So if you come to if you're ever in Calgary, you can see this. It's going to hopefully last forever. This big plaza, and then the squares that you see or sort of see faintly at the top and the bottom are benches, and underneath each one of those benches is a speaker. So this is a 16-channel surround sound system that in real time sonifies the action of the glacier. And so if you're sitting on one of these benches, or if you're walking through the plaza, you hear the voice of this glacier. It's about 5-minute delay from what's happening in real time. And then we have a 30-foot by 30-foot light sculpture inside of the plaza that also plays back a visualization of the data, as well as a visualization of urban patterns. So it shows foot traffic through the plaza, as well as car traffic throughout the city, with this idea that the glacier has its own kind of tempo and voice, and that the city has its own tempo and voice, and that part of our problem is that those things don't usually have a potential to talk to each other. And we was really informed by so Mark Hansen and Ben Rubin. Ben was my partner on this project. When I worked at the New York Times, they had an artwork in the lobby of the Times called Movable Type, and it's also a permanent piece. If you're ever in New York, you can just walk into the headquarters of the Times and go see it. And Mark said this thing to me that really resonated with me, which was that they wanted the piece not to be absorbed in the moment, but over time, because people, you know, their lives exist in these buildings in some way. And so similarly, we knew that people would not be experiencing this thing necessarily by standing in front of it the way you would normally do an artwork, but instead by kind of having it become part of your life. And so the piece is kind of meant to be somewhat subtle, but the bottom line idea of it is could we use that persistence to bring the existence of this glacier and it's kind of the reality of this glacier into people's lives, to sort of force them to understand it in a way that again, you know, reading a little data visualization on it in a website about a glacier decline, you have 20 seconds to kind of make an impression with somebody. Here we're like, okay, maybe we can take a couple of years to build up somebody's relationship with this thing so that they can care about it in a different way. Robert McFarlane, one of my favorite authors, sort of talks to this idea about when when people were starting this sort of adventures of mountaineering, and how glaciers and mountains sort of force people to think about the world in different timescales. Like a very different way of speaking. And then we were very conscious right from the beginning that in a way this piece is it's a living wake. The glacier is dying, and what you are hearing is not the sort of healthy sound of an ecosystem, but instead these kind of long drawn out death of this glacier. So these are two kind of amazing pictures that were taken exactly 100 years apart of the Bow Glacier. They're actually taken by the second one was taken by the grandchild of the first one. So it's like they went back and took the exact same picture. And so there's this idea of when we're confronted with these sort of catastrophic changes, are there ways that we can kind of break data's rules to bring these things to people's attention? And more than that, it's like not only about grabbing their attention, but it's like, can we wire it and sort of weave it into their brains in denser and more permanent ways than we would normally be able to do? So I'm going to show you one last project, and then we'll open up to conversation, and we can talk about whatever you like. I was asked, it's kind of a weird thing that happened. I got an email out of the blue from this performing arts organization in St. Louis called COCA. And they were asking if I could come and do a residency. And the whole reason I said yes to this is that I was like relatively new to America, and I had no idea about anything about St. Louis. Like, I'm Canadian, so we watch a lot of hockey games, and there's the St. Louis hockey team. And the only thing I knew about St. Louis was like that helicopter shot they would do at the beginning of the hockey game. Like, we're here in St. Louis for the, that's all I knew about it. And so I thought, what the heck, I'll say yes to this thing. And I spent a couple of years there, meeting with people, exploring the city, kind of coming up with ideas. And the idea was we were going to make this data sculpture that was going to be sort of on the campus of the art center. And it was going to be this kind of grand thing, and I never really got to a focus. But what happened in August of 2005, Michael Brown, as you probably well known, was shot and killed in Ferguson, which a lot of people maybe don't know outside of St. Louis, that Ferguson is really in St. Louis. The city of St. Louis is a small municipal area, but the suburbs of St. Louis are all each technically individual cities. So like Ferguson is for all intents and purposes part of St. Louis, even though it's not administratively part of St. Louis. So anyways, this happened when I was there doing this residency, and I came to this realization right away that the ideas that I had were just not going to work. The last thing I wanted to do was spend community money to make some sort of somewhat self-indulgent sculpture. And so we decided we changed gears, and I don't remember exactly how the idea came up, but the idea that we ended up building was this project called the Map Room. And so the Map Room is this collaborative space where people can come in and they can author these 10-foot by 10-foot maps of their lived experience in the city. And then they can use those maps as instruments to read civic data. So this came out of this itchy problem that I had always had with map data in particular, is that if I showed you all a map of some civic data from Tallinn, you would do exactly one thing. You go find where you live, and you find yourself in it. But what you won't do is go look somewhere where you don't have that experience, unless your parents live there, a friend lives there, you work there. But it's hard to get out of your own skin when you're reading map data. And so the idea with this is that we would create a kind of library of maps that people would author based on their lived experience, and that you could use those to read data, so that you would have these kind of ways to get out of your own experience and into the experience of others. So this is one of our little drawing robots that we built. This one is called Delmar. We had two of them. And so this would just sort of take some of the labor out of having to draw all the map lines. And so my team was really amazing. Our lead developer, Jane Friedhoff, made this interface where teachers, who are a big part of our audience, but also other people who are being involved, could kind of customize what they wanted. So some people wanted, you could zoom into any part of the city. Some people wanted to see streets, some people didn't. They just wanted to see the river or whatever it was. And then when you got there, we would set this up an hour before, and it would be kind of finishing your map for you, and this little robot would be going. And then you and whoever you were there with would spend between 1 and 4 hours making these maps, and you would use these decidedly non-digital tools, pens and paints and markers and what I loved about it is because of the size of it is that it became this really physical social act of map making, and so people would make these maps sort of based on their lived experience. And then we had this computer vision system in a projector mounted on top that would allow us to really precisely project different data layers on top of the maps. And so this became a place not only to make maps, but to read and also to critique civic data. So to understand the stories that this data was telling about you, but also to be able to say, hey, I don't, that doesn't really match the way that I understand my city. So like, here's a group that's going through this map that they've just made, and this is a census map being projected on top of it. And one of the things that we were really interested in this, and this comes back to something that I said with the Rice Project, is we wanted this to be social. We don't consume data socially, although obviously, given the blackboards in here, sometimes you are all consuming data socially, but usually we don't. Usually it's this really lonely experience. And so I sort of refer to this project as kind of a data dinner party, in the way that you're sort of gathering not around food, but you're gathering around data. And in the sort of space of it and the size of it allows this kind of, again, a kind of socialization and a kind of disarming, where people became more comfortable to talk about things. St. Louis is an extraordinarily racially divided city, and that is the sort of central piece of this project. And we wanted to find ways that we could bring people together to kind of talk about what's happening. So, here's a map that was made by the local food bank about food scarcity and where their food bank locations were, and you can kind of see how it works when people project different map layers onto it. And it was this really amazing experience. People would come out of it with this understanding of the city that they didn't have before. And then, one of the things that I really like about this is that from the beginning, we wanted to understand these maps as maps that sat alongside other formal records of the city. And so we made an agreement with the city's archives that these maps would become part of the archive. And so these now sit alongside all those other like historically important maps in the city. So I'll just show you, I'm just going to tell you this one story. This is a group of 6th graders from a school called Brittany Woods. And they are in this neighborhood, which is actually up by one of the universities, which has this really stark divide between income levels and race and all kinds of things. And so they came in, we developed a curricula for the schools to teach about mapping as a creative thing. And so they came in with this idea, and then they made this map, which was based on, so this is a zoom in into their neighborhood. And what they did is they talked about places in their neighborhood that they felt were safe and unsafe. And this is really, was really amazing to watch them do this. I did this little video. We did this for every map, these little time lapses. And so after the people made the map, we have a facilitator. This is Emmett, our facilitator, and they would kind of lead each individual group through the map layers and kind of encourage discussion. And this is another thing that I really got out of this project, is that facilitation can be a really important thing when you're trying to understand how people connect to data. And again, I think we kind of burden ourselves with the idea that like people have to be able to understand something completely when you go and look at the data visualization. And by embracing facilitation, we were able to kind of put it into this structure that opened people up and kind of encouraged conversation in a way that wouldn't have happened if you just kind of let them go into this environment. So well, the reason why I love this story so much is that the map that the students got the most excited about and most interested about is the one that's being projected on the map right now. And so this is a 19, I can't remember the exact year, but it's from the 1930s, and it's a redlining map. So some of you might be familiar with these maps, but what happened is after the Great Depression in the United States, there was this movement to sort of reinvigorate the economy by essentially forgiving people's mortgages, kind of giving them money to get back on their feet with property ownership. And so across the country in every city, there were these maps commissioned called redlining maps. And what they showed, the banks essentially, they instructed which neighborhoods they would be encouraged to give loans in and which ones they weren't. And what we know now is that these were deliberately racist instruments, and they were like specifically designed to disenfranchise Black people from home ownership. So it was like horrifying, right? It's like everyone's in this terrible situation, and these people jump in and say, hey, this is a good point for us to like get all these Black homeowners out of these neighborhoods by not giving them loans so that they default on their mortgages and so on and so on. But what these students realized is that when you look at this redlining map from 1931, I think, and then you looked at like every other map, you could see these boundaries written in those maps. And not only that, the students said, hey, when I walk to school, like there's this one street that I cross, and when I cross the street, like the sidewalk is in disrepair on the other side. And they could see that in this map that was drawn in 1931. And you know, they actually went back to their school and they did this whole project about redlining. They put up posters all over their neighborhood, like that's how I like tell people about this. And I say this a lot about this project, that if like I had one outcome off of like the 6 years and however many thousands of dollars of my own money I spent on this project, if you just told me that like a group of 6th graders would become engaged about like systemic racism in their neighborhoods, I would be like, yes, we succeeded. But you know, this happened over and over again with this project. And it really resonated with me because it actually succeeded in doing a lot of the things that I had sort of convinced myself that I was doing through data visualization, but that I often wasn't, which is that I was actually kind of changing the way that people like understand dense topics, like complex things. And I realized that you know, again, to kind of get back to this idea of breaking rules, is that part of the reason that we tend to be unsuccessful in this is that we just don't give ourselves enough space. We constrain ourselves really specifically in the way that we sort of can or we should tell these stories. You know, when I was working on this project, I got really into the writing of this woman named Grace Lee Boggs. She was a labor activist in Detroit. She's a really amazing writer. And before she died, she wrote this book called The Next American Revolution, which I sort of go back to whenever I lose hope about the future of the country that I live in. Because it really is this idea of like, how could we envision a different future? And she talks in this quote about this idea of coming up with these new concepts, you know, these more participatory and place-based concepts of citizenship and democracy. And this sort of double underlines the whole concept of this book that I wrote. And I realized, like, as I was writing this book, the sort of whole concept of the work that I've been doing for the last 10 years. And so the book is called Living in Data. And, you know, the central argument of the book is that we sort of live in data involuntarily. Like every piece of our lives is affected by data in some way. Like we live in it, but we haven't sort of yet learned how to inhabit it or how to be active citizens in it. And so this project and a lot of the stuff that I show you here is the sort of idea of coming up with ways to do these sort of exact things that that Grace was saying in that quote. Yeah, I think that's it.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let's maybe answer this.
We'll go to the back of the bus here and see if anybody has any.
Good. Yes. So you want to unshare the screen?
Oh yeah.
So yes. So thank you very much. So we have about 45 minutes to discuss. So there's plenty of aspects. And I see one hand online. That's great. I want to emphasize one point, which I think is quite interesting. Is we had a conversation yesterday about emergence versus data. So you mentioned that data is given as divine, and there's often this kind of thing that our colleagues have questions which are ingrained in our disciplines, and it's sort of a hard thing to just look at data and say, oh, maybe there's another question we can ask.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing, you have shown another example of emergence that can happen, which is not only is there patterns in data that emerge that we haven't seen yet, but also the interaction that you have emerging. If you walk into St. Louis, you had no idea that this was going on.
Yeah, and that project really changed my mind about a lot of things. When one of the things we did come into that project with this kind of prescriptive approach where, well, we were going to come into these communities and like really bring them wisdom through data. But what we realized actually was that a lot of what came out of it was the opposite, was that, and I said this before, was like people seeing the ways in which their representation in these data sets wasn't either complete or was incorrect. It was like this way to vet the data that this never happens. Like it never happens. In civic data is so bad at telling its own story, right? Like every city has a civic data portal, but it's usually only accessible by people with a certain technical expertise. Like we're not good at taking that data and bringing it back to the communities that it was collected from. And that was like something that I realized was not only like a kind of good thing to do, but also like help the quality of the work, because you by bringing it in front of these people, you're like, oh, this is the thing that we believe, and you can tell me whether that thing is like real or not.
Mike.
Thank you. It was very interesting, and thank you very much for presenting this, and many of the visualizations you showed are very impressive. However, as people who attend this sort of thing know, I usually work here as a devil's advocate. So I would like to ask you to poke you in a couple of places.
Sure.
One of the things I wanted to ask is basically, well, in some of these things you've shown, it is clear what sort of new information we get from this presentation. For example, this beautiful thing about a river being not a single line, but a set of evolving things which are different at different times. It is quite obvious what you get from there. It is quite obvious what you get from the story about zoning rules. Yes. The last one, it is, well, basically a very famous thing that it exists, but still it is very clear from here. But on the other hand, I'm not sure I understand what you get from for example, these piles of rice representing people. I mean, you know that there is a huge number of people, and you see that there is a huge number of. I mean, it is in a sense beautiful as an art, but is it informative? That is one thing I wanted to ask. Another thing I wanted to ask, which a bit worried me when you were talking about the sort of, so to speak, dying glacier, although it is not human being or animal, it is not dying, of course. But anyway, when you were commenting on what you are trying to do, you said you were trying to wire in some information into brains of people, and this is a literal quotation. how I'm not sure I understand. It sounds a little bit scary to me, and it sounds in contradiction with your promotion of participant democracy and stuff like this. And this third very minor thing is that, of course, there are cities in the world where the fraction of foreign-born population is larger than in New York City, for example, Los Angeles, not to mention Dubai,
No, that's
where
not true.
it is 85%, as I Googled while you were talking.
Okay.
But in terms of
If you want to proofread the rest of my talk, I can send it to you.
Yeah, but it seems like the total number of foreign-born people is foreign-born residents is the largest in New York City, indeed, and you're completely right on that. So that's it. Thank you very much. And I just wanted to warn you that I will have to leave because of a doctor appointment, but
Sure. Yeah, I mean,
it is not to mean anything.
I'm probably going to forget the questions because I'm tired, but to the Rice Show, which is what I call it, and James gets mad when I call it that because he likes the real title of it. This is a theater performance. So, my reading of it as a kind of data thing is not the intent of the project. But what is interesting to me is that numeracy, the sort of basic numeracy, and again, I talked about this idea of when we were in COVID, we just get faced with all these numbers. We aren't good at understanding those numbers. And so to me, I saw the show and it was actually really remarkable at how good of a job it does at doing something that we do all the time in, especially simple versions of data visualization. It's like quantitative comparison, right? It's like, this is like one quantity versus the other. And so as just a purely functional thing, as somebody who has made hundreds of visualizations of that sort of exact same thing, the experience of that show was more effective than anything that I'd ever done, and it had to do with the idea of these tiny little like discrete objects, the idea that they are, like volume that you can walk around, the sort of inclusion of, the performance of it, I just love. Like there's the idea of people measuring it, because it also brings in this kind of process of it. And so, one of the first questions that people have about that show is like, are you counting every grain of rice? It's like, of course we're not counting every grain of rice and 7 billion grains of rice, but it also, that's really interesting to me because you ask that question when it's rice, but you don't ask that question when I see a chart. If I show you a chart and I label it with like 6,751,000, people are like, oh, okay, there was exactly that. Like the piece actually does a really good job at like, it's speaking of how counting works, and it's a real simple thing, but it's remarkable, and they're still touring the show around the world. And if you have a chance to see it, I would, really.
Yeah. Thank you. That makes perfect sense to me. What you just said.
Yeah, and then the second, I don't want to get into a conversation about animism, about whether a glacier is dying or not. But I when I said that we're trying to like rewire people's brains, it's not so much about like, okay, first of all, it is a very political piece, and I fundamentally believe in the idea that humans have caused climate change, and I think that glacier is disappearing because of the direct impact of our actions. And I'm an artist, and I'm allowed to be political. I'm not an objective person, so we built it in front of an oil and gas company for a reason. Like we're making a statement there. But when I was talking about like changing people's minds, it wasn't really about that. It was about like, it's just about persistence. It's about reminding people every single day that this thing that's very far away is there, and such that nobody can go out to that glacier every day, but it's a way to like to bring it closer to people. And that's like, to me, the foundational thing there. And as somebody who like does a lot of conservation work, and I do a lot of like kind of field biology work, one of the huge challenges we have is that you can't bring people to these places every day. And so I'm interested in these ideas of how data can be used in these longer term persistent ways to remind people of like these important spaces. So that's, that's what I was thinking about when I'm talking about not really interested in changing, people's minds. I'm interested in
basically informing them.
Establishing a new relationship between them and something that is quite hard to get a relationship with. It's hard to get a relationship with a glacier. I ran the piece in my own house while I was testing it for about 6 months, and I really did like feel like I was connected to this thing. I would hear it make noise and just feel like I was there with it. And that is something that I think is important.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There's another question coming up. I'd like to make some interjection, which is in German, the words understanding is called begreifen, which means to grasp. And there is actually some cognitive science results that if you're allowed to touch something, you're way faster in recognizing. And so one could actually make sort of a scholarly argument that the perceptualization of the amount of people on Earth with something three-dimensional you can walk around and actually touch, get a feeling for how much is 100, how much is 10, how much is 1. Actually is a different form of understanding than from just sort of like having a picture, which by the way also interesting. You have an image in English. In German it would be an Abbild, which has sort of the it carries that it's sort of some kind of cough of something, right? So that again is more sculptural than just visual, and I think that is sort of something which different languages have different affordances of doing that. Like Italian would be on the other end, where everything is the sense. You sense something. It doesn't really say if you touch it or see it or hear it. And I think we need to sort of work around that. And I think I hear you well, you're basically rightfully making the point that maybe data visualization is too narrow. If you just have a screen and there's like some K diagram and some colors and that's it. So we cannot grasp it.
Or walk around it or talk around it.
Yeah.
That's like that spatiality of that piece and the scale of it is really important too. Like, yeah, it's hard to describe on a screen. I hate having to talk about these pieces by showing pictures because you need to see them. Like you need to experience. That's the point of them.
Thank you. Mila.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. I kind of like think that what was particularly interesting for me, and what I kind of like really found kind of like really meaningful also to my own work is that the way you talk about kind of like how making data personal or kind of like personal connection with the data is kind of like one of the important things in many of the projects that you showed us. Then also this kind of like that there needs to be time to understand and to actually with this connection to grasp what it actually is. And then of course you have this social effect there as well. In many places, either kind of like people have been gathering together to produce something, or they are maybe in kind of like in a public sphere or something like that. So this is kind of like what I found most and especially interesting in your talk. So I actually wanted to ask you to maybe elaborate further. You mentioned these sixth graders in St. Louis who kind of like were, very enthusiastic about this mapping project. But I was wondering, have you been talking also with other people in the, participants of the other projects, how they have, do you have kind of like some kind of like understanding on how their understanding has changed over time, and if it has, how has it changed? And kind of like I would be really interested in hearing a little bit more about this. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, given the choice, I don't do that kind of thing. It makes me itchy. And in part because maybe all of us have had this experience, and I'm speaking as an artist here, not as a sort of data visualization person, where you'll see an artwork, and then it's not till years later that something like rings in your head about it. And so when you ask people about work like this, it's hard to, again, speaks to this, like sometimes we did the MoMA show. So the MoMA show, we did extensive audience interviews with people who had watched the piece afterwards. And it was actually really interesting to talk to them about how the piece sort of changed their idea about what the museum is and how it functions, and like how did they think differently about art after they saw the work. And it was one of those amazing experiences where like I felt like the people were being paid, because the things they were saying were like exactly what we wanted them to say, like about how it like challenged their ideas of you know, particularly that piece about the men and women's names, about like how the museum is historically operated, and so on and so on. But my challenge with that is like we would ask them right afterward, and I wish we had an opportunity to like follow them up with them like a year later and be like, hey, did this ring anything? Because and again, you know, one of the things that art has always been very good at, and you could like make the argument that it's the reason why we in some ways the reason why we have it is because it like negotiates with things that are nuanced and often contradictory and not easy to like understand right away. It's not like a data visualization where I'm like showing somebody something and you're like, hey, here's the thing. And so, you know, with a piece like the performance, we were less, it was very intentionally not pedagogical. We weren't like trying to teach a lesson. It was more of like, can we do this series of things that might sort of change the way you understand the museum? And so, yeah, it's challenging to me because I do want to know how these pieces affect people, but I also like, I'm aware that some of that is just always going to be intractable.
Thank you.
We also
Maybe one question in the room?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So thank you first of all for sharing your fascinating work. I have a simple question: that who ordered the Brookfield, who commissioned the Brookfield project? So how do you get into this kind of counter-hegemonic spaces?
The city of Calgary has a 1% for the arts program, where every one of those buildings that gets built has to spend 1% on public art commissions, and that's a $300 million building. So so they spent $3 million on a series, not only our piece, although we did get paid very generously. It took 5 years to make, and it's a very expensive piece and permanent. So my partner on that piece, Ben Rubin, is really sort of solidly an artist, whereas my practice sort of maps around all kinds of things. And so we were approached as a studio. You know, sometimes those public art pieces, they'll have like an open bid. This one, they hired an art advisor who recommended to the company, I think they recommended 4 artists and they chose 2. And so they recommended us as part of that. And then we got that commission. Yeah, public art, I have a really weird relationship with it. I love the making of it, but if you ever want to get into like a career that involves a lot of people nitpicking every single thing that you do, it's really like, it's so hard. Like it's committee after committee after committee, and in that particular piece, we did this incredibly stupid thing where not only did we have to deal with all the bureaucracy of installing a public art piece, but we also had to figure out how to get a permanent sensor station in a national park. So it's like we joked. I joked that the medium of that piece was bureaucracy because we just like spent so much time trying to like get that thing done. But one of the ways we got away with it is, or one of the ways we validated it is that so all the data that's being collected from that station is available to scientists. So it's this permanent station that's now collected, 6 years of data that people can access. So I was interested in the idea of a project that functions in that way as well, like a resource for
recording.
Yeah, exactly.
Mark.
Hello. It's so great to listen other people that resonate so much with my work and with what I believe. I had done public art. You can see Experience 1 in the center of Tallinn in the night, if you want.
Oh, yeah, awesome.
In Nuku Theater. And I know what you were talking about. I know very well Calgary, and I know very well. I'm not slightly sure. I think I passed your work also. I have been exhibiting 3 times in Calgary, and I did residency in Banff, and I really like it. It has a piece of my heart, Banff Center, and the Banff Mountains is really like one of the more incredible places in the planet I had visited. Just back to the talk, I think that you point something that it really resonates me. Maybe I had think about, but you really clearly stated that is that I think that I see like this, that the data is a compression way to get some numbers. And then like representing in a chart, it is like still a way of reduction. While when you put it in an art, you kind of decompress again. Because when someone, I don't know, when you count in debts, for example, there is an emotional part of this that is not represented in the chart. Rather, when you actually represent it in an artwork that has like a data sculpture of it, then you decompress again and you can express some of the things that has this data embedded, that it was reduced and lost. And when you put it in a chart, then it's just like, it doesn't matter. You can just count apples or deaths or heartbeats or whatever thing you can imagine. But I think that's why even like some scientists still are resilient to what artists can do. Actually, artists can do quite a lot of things, even in functional way, because I think you were mentioning some, and yeah, you can maybe if you think that you agree with what I just stated, or just comment.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I got into doing this type of work is that the data visualization is a kind of magic trick. It's like I don't care what the set of numbers is, and we kind of make it into a thing. And we see the same thing with like these clustering algorithms. It's like as long as the system has a certain set of properties, I can do the same magic trick with it. And I got both kind of bored and exhausted with that. And I wanted to understand how I could make work that spoke to the kind of texture of the data, the provenance of it, where it came from, like how it sits in the world. And that's not to discount, by the way, like I'm not in any way trying to like discount what we're normally considered to be sort of classic visualization, or to say that we should be replacing it, or I'm saying there's like a whole nother approach. And when I talk to my students about this, even when I was teaching data visualization classes, I would give them this sort of challenge. And when in public art, one of the things that's really excited about it is that its relationship with the site, like this sort of site specificity of it, where it like a good public art like can really only reside in the place where it is, because it has a dialogue with that place. And so I would give my students the same challenge, like, can you make a site-specific data visualization where the site is that data visualization? And so you said it, it's like, can you do something with this data that could only be done with this data? That actually isn't, the graph that you could export from Tableau or whatever it is. Like those multi-purpose tools are really useful, but they don't allow you to like, yeah, engage with the nuance of this stuff. And that is like, to me, also really important in engaging with the public about work, because to be frank, I think we're like all as a culture exhausted with charts and graphs. And so no matter how important the information you're showing somebody in your, scatter plot or whatever it is, like the very nature that it's just that is going to bore, like people are like going to shut the door for a lot of people. And by making it more evocative and you're allowing people to get into it. When I was teaching data visualization, I always talked about this idea of the ooh-ah principle, right? So it's like the ooh part is like catching people's attention who wouldn't normally pay attention, and then the ah is teaching them something. And to me, like you have to have that balance, because your data visualization can be very precise and can tell the exact story you want to tell, but if nobody's going to look at it in the first place, then you've kind of failed in it, unless you're talking again to each other. And as soon as you're not talking to each other, you need to find ways to engage with people. And yeah, anyway, long way of saying that I totally agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I think that you nailed it in many things, and I'm very inspired with what you said. And it's just like going beyond is that I think that there is a lot of data that there is like hidden layers. It's like we're talking a lot about the hidden layers on the neural networks, but there is hidden layers of the data. There is many layers that we escape it, because like our sensory systems that transform the analog to the digital, they just like not precise, and they just take one part of it. And because if we will really do in a proper way, we will produce so much data that will be so multidimensional that we will not be able to grasp anything. Then like because of this, we reduce it and we just like take the much little part of it. And that is like what I think art can just like just display it in a much more way. Like it's like the grains of rice. Like you can see a chart and you can see the grains, and I'm absolutely sure by my experience and as an opinion that the amount of experience and meaningful experience you will have with this piece, it will be much more huge than if you just see a paper with a graph, or a screen with a graph, or big screen with a graph. Because like the experience is partly constructed with your body and with your body in the space, and we are so used to the screen that this interaction is not meaningful anymore. We just 8 hours, 20 hours a day with the screen. And the next thing is that the numbers, if you show random numbers instead of like visualizing, then they also like our brain doesn't engage with this thing. Means I think that artists will have a huge role on kind of this kind of displaying in different way. And Natalie Jeremejenko is also an artist I curated in 2004 this Spondency Index. I don't know if you know, it's a very interesting piece of her where actually she counted the people who was suicided in the Golden Bridge of San Francisco, and then he make it an index out of it, like also kind of speaking of this, like the financial way of making index, because actually San Francisco Bridge is one of the much used spot where people suicide. And she used computer vision in the, I mean, actually she took the kind of the sensory data out of it. And I think that the other thing is like with the trees work that you show with Natalie is that, yeah, I mean, this is when we're talking about the slow, I mean, like the slow way of taking the data. I mean, it's known that the way of making misinformation is by overwhelming people with data. Like, because your perception system, it is not able to kind of disentangle what is real and what is not when you overwhelm them with data. Means when you actually go slow, then you can make a thing meaningful, more reasonable understanding of the data. Means I think is also connecting with your thought about the slowing down in a way of like the perception of the data.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I'd like to connect a number of threads here, which is we're talking about people bringing something to the data, people engaging with the piece every single day and stuff like that. There's something every postdoc and PhD student here knows, because I ask every single one of them in their job interview, what makes you most enthusiastic about what you're interested in doing. And so that's something I tried to do in classes for a very long time, and I was struggling for years to put the word BYOD, like bring your own data.
Yeah.
Syllabus, because I thought, like, you know, maybe
Yeah.
my esteemed colleagues take it as a double kind of thing, but at some point I put it in the syllabus, and for me this was liberating, because all of a sudden there was this thing that not only do people bring data and then they visualize it and then do some scatter plot, but typically they bring something more with it, like their whole lived experience in Isfahan, or their whole lived experience in some neighborhood of Bogota. And then as this comes together, there is emergence happening, not only in the found in the data, but also sort of like in the how the project is performed, and also in the questions that come in the audience. And so you give a lot of examples where this really works well, this kind of making emergence happen. The question is how systematic can we be, or should we be systematic in this, or should we not be systematic in this? So I was very surprised when you said you're reluctant in doing the kind of thing of like then asking people like what do you learn and stuff like that, because that also is a source of data that's pretty amazing. Like what makes people tick when you live, and why are you happy? Like Jane Jacobs would do that. She would only talk to people, right? So how could we, right?
I understand. I mean, again, I'm not discounting those approaches. I'm just like saying personally, it's something that I like, it's a piece of the puzzle that I'm not. Like, you know, when I read a lot more fiction than I read nonfiction. And when I read fiction, I like fiction that doesn't neatly tell the story, you know, because those are always the types of storytelling that have appealed to me.
Because you can fill in the gaps.
Yeah, right. And so when I am wearing my art hat, I actually am like least interested in making something that somebody will like, I'll be able to interview them and they'll say like, oh, this is the thing I got out of it. Like, I don't want that. You know, to think about that, like almost like disrupts the process in a way that I don't want to do. I would like people to be able to stand in front of this thing and get whatever they get out of it. And in fact, like there's an intimacy to that maybe there's a reason why I don't want to go and interview them, is that I don't want to like kind of break that very private feeling of like, you got your thing out of this and I don't really need to know what it is. Like there is a tendency when you do work that involves the digital to sort of to go in that direction, whereas like nobody's asking a painter to go and interview the people who's looked at the painting and ask like what they got out of it, right? The same with like, you know, theater or whatever. I mean, there is something that happens when we use computers that people are like, oh, we should be able to quantify this because it's like it's computational. And so I'm just speaking out loud as like the ways that I find that to be like a little itchy, you know, and so.
So let me ask you a difficult follow-up question.
Yeah.
So, you know, Palantir, right? I agree.
I mean, they're called Palantir.
Yeah. Now we talked about performing data.
Yeah.
There are a bunch of conversations in the last year with different people where sort of group of people were sort of convinced we're living through another counter-reformation. So it's literally like the Jesuits sort of sort of throwing half of, like, using science and technology to convince people of whatever, throwing half of science out of the way, and instead of telling a bullshit story. In some sense, that's what volunteers do. Like, they have all the data, they can make sense of it, and then they tell people bullshit story and exploit what they can actually do with it. And let's anthropomorphize AI, like Sophie the robot, which is very clearly not a general AI, but mocap, animatronics, Imagineering, as it's called in Disney. That is also performance of data.
Yes.
And so the question is, where's the boundary? Like, how do we differentiate data performance for good from data performance used as a kind of evil tool?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, we're
In the same business.
yeah. I mean, you sort of start by like discarding objectivity, right? Again, and in like embracing the idea that everything is biased in the way that you're beginning. The very minute you decide to collect data, you've already made a decision, and that decision is going to like trickle down the pipeline. And no matter how much we try to convince ourselves that we're apolitical or not we don't have an agenda behind our work, there's like, it's still there. And so I guess I don't feel that tension, because the ethical issues that you're describing are very different than it's not that they're telling my problem with Palantir is not that they're telling the wrong data story.
Okay.
My problem with them is that they're like surveilling people without their consent. They're working with governments that do horrific things to their people. There's a baseline underneath that is already problematic. And the problem is not that they're spinning the data. The problem is what is sort of wider and more morally bankrupt than that.
Thank you very much. Should we do it around? I don't see any hands up. There's one. Okay.
Hey.
I just wanted to say, I have a really close relationship with maps. I studied geography, and all my studies are based in geography, so I'm really connected to maps. And I always think of maps as the source of understanding space and time in one place.
Yeah.
But the perspective, I've never thought of maps as a source of as a source of art. So I just feel really inspired by this work that you were doing. And also, I had the opportunity to do social mapping, like the St. Louis project, with the indigenous community, in which we were trying to in Ecuador.
Oh, wow.
So we were trying to understand the ancestral space to put it into the new world space. So we gathered together with a lot of indigenous people from different ages, and just pencils and big papers, and it was a really enjoyable experience. So when I saw this, I came back to that memory, and I felt really inspired. So
thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I can send you we have like the curricula that we made around the idea of like map making as a creative medium. It's like there's so much really amazing work that's been done around that. I'd love to hear more about the indigenous mapping. In the book that I wrote, there's one of the last chapters is actually about this group of people of Maori in New Zealand who are using data in really interesting ways, and around both in sort of concepts of how data can be used, but in the ways that they're engaging with communities. And I think that there's a lot of really interesting work being done right now that sort of centers that like indigenous ways of knowing, and not trying to kind of put our sort of ideas of what data is and should be and kind of moving it into those spaces, but instead kind of reversing. I'll send this link as well, but one of the papers that really blew me away when I was researching the book was this paper by a group of Maori scholars about what's it called? The data information knowledge pyramid, which probably everybody's seen. But the paper sort of re-envisions that through a Maori worldview. And it's actually one of the papers that just totally changed my brain. It was really fascinating. It's sort of one of those things that kind of reaches down and uproots some piece of you that you realized, oh, I have this really foundational idea about how these things should work that is rooted in my own cultural, like in historical, like politics. And by turning it around, it was like, oh, okay, that really, really is one of the best papers I've ever read also.
Thank you very much. I have one last question.
Is it about birds?
No. Then it's the second to last question. I can make it about birds.
No, it's okay.
So one thing I found nice is that you not only let them produce maps in St. Louis, but you made them stare at data, like you projected this other data on top of it. And I don't know how far you agree that I think we have too much emphasis on producing data analysis and data visualization, and there is almost no staring at data visualization. You know, staring at data, but
let alone by the people who that data comes from. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like community data, you know, 0.something% of it goes back to the people that produce that data in any meaningful way.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's even this thing, like I have this a lot, like every second funding application, query, whatever I get back is like, that's just observation.
Yeah.
And I think we, you know, it's just staring, it's just underrated.
Staring is underrated. You know, it's interesting when we were working with these kids, so they were mostly like middle school kids, but we did younger groups as well. And when the teachers would be prepared and we would actually give them a link to the different data sets so they could show the students. And what we heard all the time was that the students did not care at all about the data. Yeah. And then as soon as they were there and it was projected on their maps, like they could not get enough of it. They were like so curious about it. And it was like that, it was a switch that just completely flipped, right? Where you had this group of people who the way that we would traditionally show them this data, they did not care at all to this like really active conversation. And oh, let's see this, can we see this? Like, and so that was like actually really remarkable. And that's a group of people that we underserve 100% with data, you know, and partly it is because the way we understand it's like an adult thing. Now that's another thing that I love about the Rice show. Like that's probably the one example and the best example of let's take the kids to go see some data, right? Like that is really amazing. It's really amazing that like the way that it's built is like facilitates that. And like what an amazing challenge to give yourself would be like, how do I like tell a data story in a way that would engage with like a 7-year-old? And it seems frivolous, but it's actually like, it's important to understand how when we teach these things to people with, you know, again, people with different literacies and kind of attention spans and so on and so on.
So we only have 3 minutes. So my bird question is a little bit unfair because you could probably go on for another talk. How about birds?
How about birds? Birds are great. That's all I'm going to say about it. Yeah, I mean, I was saying this in the meeting this morning, but and I think most people in this room probably already know this, but you know, birding is just this like astoundingly rich data area. And this is absolutely fascinating to be diving in. I'm writing a new book about birds and data and to sort of dive into the history of how closely tied like birding has always been to data. But also, you know, it's really interesting what's happening right now is you know, so I when I go out birding, I use this tool called eBird, which is like a checklisting tool. And it's become this really ubiquitous thing that birders use. And to me, this is like a really interesting example of like the computer changing our behavior to do what it wants. Like, it's like making birders into better data collectors, which is really an interesting thing. It's you know, when I write in the book about this concept of schematic bias, where like the actual schema that the data is going into biases the way that we like can understand things, and so you know, eBird is really kind of doing that on a really large scale, where it's like turning birders into counters, because that's what it does. And so there's this really fascinating, it's just a really fascinating area to think about. And you know, machine learning, we were talking, this is something that I just discovered, actually, that we're in the middle of writing a piece about, but so the big tool, machine learning tool for birding is a tool called Merlin, which does image and audio recognition of birds. It's really amazing. But if you trace that project back, it goes through this consortium called Visipedia, which you may be aware of. And if you trace that back, it was born out of this lab. And there was two sort of data set projects that came out of that lab for computer vision, and one was Visipedia and the other was ImageNet. So you have these divergent paths of like how computer vision is performed, where Visipedia is really interested in building in experts into the system and sort of doing community and engagement and building. It's like a really human in approach, whereas like ImageNet is this really broadly human out approach. And there's this really like cool thing that we discovered of like this historical divergence of like these kind of tale of two futures of these things that came out of this exact same place at the exact same time, as kind of involves birds. Yeah, anyways.
Thank you very much. Simple question. Fascinating answer. Yeah, thank you very much. So let's promise we stare at somebody else's map.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for all the big information.
Sure, thank you.
And let's stare at birds and not count them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wait a minute. Applause. But I need to be one duty. I need to say what's happening next week, which is Mike Testamont and Holger Kastorp, Forgotten Books: The Application of Unseen Species Models to the Survival of Culture. For those who have not realized what that was, there's a still not too handful of culture papers in Science Magazine, and this was the last one. It's digital humanities people who actually are quite popular in using code in history, teamed up with an ecologist who is actually of old age and used the model to sort of estimate the bias in medieval book manuscripts. And that became not only a science paper, a short science paper, but a full paper. But, you know, one of these moments when you have a single premise, you can summarize it in one sentence. But it's coming out of the humanities. So this is also something which I think is a really interesting avenue of cultural analytics. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.